How's it going, everyone? With Pioneer RCQ season winding down, it's time to look forward to our next set in Bloomburrow. This set has a lot of really powerful cards, as well as some very interesting cards that may even open up some new decks and new archetypes. So I'm going to look at the top 25 cards that I'm most interested in for Pioneer. These aren't going to be ranked in any order, but these are the 25 cards that caught my attention and that I'm looking forward to messing around with once the set comes out in a few weeks. First up, we have Vinereap Mentor. This card really reminds me of Blood Tithe Harvester in red-black, but this time it's green-black, and instead of a blood, you get a food. It immediately evokes that same kind of interest, though it doesn't give you the removal that Harvester did, and I don't think it's going to be as ubiquitous. I think in decks that want any kind of extra permanence laying around or are interested in food, this is a great option. Next up, we have Parting Gust. This one is a little interesting to me. Being able to blink your own creatures for white-white is not a great rate. I don't think most people would do it even with the +1/+1 counter. But being able to gift a fish and essentially destroy whatever your opponent's best creature is, especially since it exiles, means that it's a really good option for a lot of decks that don't really care about giving a 1/1, but really do want to get rid of things like Shieldred, Vein Ripper, things like that that are going to be tougher to interact with. Now, obviously, Control may not want it as much since they don't have a lot to blink themselves, but in a lot of aggro decks where you just need to push through one really big threat, this can blink a creature for a turn or just get rid of it and give them a tapped fish so you can attack through. I think it'll be a very interesting card for sideboards in a lot of decks. Next up is Long River's Pull, and this one has my undivided attention. I think blue counter target creature spell, not really worth playing, but the gift a card side of just making it counter spell is kind of incredible. Obviously, countering a spell and giving them a card isn't really where you want to be, but when you pair this with any of the cards that stop draw cards like Narset Parter of Veils, Notion Thief, or many of the other cards like that, it becomes very powerful. And I think in most cases, you're going to want to counter a creature anyway, but in the cases where you do have to just use it as counterspell, give them a card, a lot of times you're saving it for the card that's going to win the game or really mess up your plan. So it ends up that the card is probably better countered than the card you're giving them. Next up, we have Feed the Cycle, and this one's interesting because I think at its worst, it's Hero's Downfall, which again doesn't really see play in a lot of decks, but at its best, it's an instant speed way to kill any creature or planeswalker, and the forage cost is very reasonable, especially in the mid to late game. But again, as we were talking about with the Mentor, I think there's a little sub-theme of food kicking around, and some decks are going to be able to just pair these cards that give you incidental objects of food, and all of a sudden you have a very, very potent removal spell that can kill anything. So I think this is one of the ones that's a little bit underrated just because forage, we haven't played with it yet, but I think a lot of decks, especially control decks, will have no problem getting rid of 3 cards in the mid to late game, and this is just unconditional removal that will be very, very good. And again, worst case, you can save your cards and just pay the extra mana if it's in the mid to late game. Next up, we have Eddy Muck Crab, and this is an interesting one. It's kind of a flash combination of Elder Deep Fiend and Tolarian Terror. Being able to tap down 2 creatures to push through damage is great, or to be able to stop an opponent from attacking, and then you're able to untap and attack with this 5/5, both very good. I think being able to flash it in and block would make it a, an all-star immediately, but since it comes in tapped if it's not your turn, I think just being able to lock down creatures for a turn to get in a big swing can be very powerful. And I think, if you're playing a deck like Phoenix, a blue threat for a 5/5 is great. I will say, since it only counts graveyard and not exile, it does have a little bit of a push and pull. This might see more play if we see like a blue-red prowess deck start to come around, which there are plenty of cards in the set that make me think it could happen. Next up, we have Dewdrop Cure, and this one to me, slam dunk and Amalia. Some of the decks have been playing Return to the Ranks, Living Dirge, both good, but Dewdrop Cure does everything you want it to. You can bring back 2 cards without gifting anything that are mana value 2 or less, so that's, your Amalia or your Walker or your Innkeeper, or you can give them a card and get 3 things back. So again, you look at a lot of decks that are going to be piecemeal interacting with you, killing your important combo pieces. All of a sudden you can get them back for 3 mana, or give them a card and get 3 pieces back, which can be Innkeeper, Wildgrowth Walker, Amalia, and you just assemble the combo immediately. It is a very powerful card, and I am concerned that this is going to make dealing with Amalia with non-exile effects very challenging. Next up, we have Bandit's Talent, and this is an interesting one. It's one of the first classes we have on here, and I think the classes in this set are very interesting, very hit or miss. Some of them are really powerful, some of them less so, but this one to me stands out as an interesting card for decks like Waste Not, where it enters, they are going to discard a non-land card, so you always get a real card instead of a land. Otherwise, they have to get rid of 2 cards. So you're already in a good spot if they get rid of 2 or a real spell. The second level being very cheap is good, and it allows you to sort of do the mono black discard of old, where you would have these effects that would sit on the battlefield, hard to interact with, and start draining them of life. And I think keeping them at a low hand total and then being able to chunk them for 2 every turn is very good. And then again, at the last one, if you draw a card in your draw step and you have an opponent with 1 or fewer cards in their hand, you get an extra card. One of the reasons Waste Not is struggling is that people have figured out that you're really able to just dump your hand, play off the top, and they have a lot of dead cards. This allows you to kind of mitigate that, and in those situations where you've run them out of cards, now you're getting real advantage time after time. Next up, we have Zoraline Cosmos Collar, and this card to me feels like fixed Lurrus. Obviously, it's not a companion. It doesn't do everything Lurrus does, and it has to either enter or attack to get its trigger, but it gains life whenever you attack with it or another bat, and then you can pay 2 life to recur things with mana value 3 or less onto the battlefield with a finality counter. So you can't just keep chaining it. It doesn't get the benefit of like the baubles and things where you just keep going over and over again every turn. But as far as a standard or pioneer level card, this card is going to be very good at stopping people from interacting with your other cards, because this is a lightning rod, and if they don't have interaction, you are just going to churn value over and over again. So as a 5 mana play, it immediately gets you back a 3-drop, and I think in a lot of matchups this is going to be one of the mid to late game haymakers that you play on turn 5, turn 6, and then all of a sudden they've run out of removal and you're just buying back threats. Next up, we have Thundertrap Trainer, and this one is a better version of Augur of Bolas. So, I mean, better is relative, right? It's a wizard Augur of Bolas that hits all non-creatures, non-land, so you can hit enchantments and things like that. So it does have a wider range, so you're less likely to miss. It also has Offspring 4, so you're able to, in the mid to late game, pay 6 mana and get 2 of this effect, which is very powerful. Obviously, being a 1-2 is a little bit worse than a 1-3 as far as your ability to block for aggro, but in a lot of matchups, it can work fine as a roadblock to save a little life after drawing you a card. Obviously, in a format where Play with Fire, being a 1-2 is very important as a breakpoint, so I think this will be a very good card in a lot of decks, but it's not going to be super ubiquitous since it doesn't pull double duty as a great blocker and getting you a card. Next up, we have Sunspine Lynx, and this one's a very interesting one to me. At 2 red, it sits just at the wrong spot as far as answering Amalia, in that it can be Skyclave Apparitioned, but it does still prevent people from gaining life, so they need to have an answer to it right then. Damage can't be prevented, which is kind of nice. Again, mostly for other formats, I would imagine, but in the niche case where it comes up, it's good. But what it really matters is it's a 4 mana 5/4 that ETBs and does half of a price to progress to each player. So obviously you want to play this in a deck that's running a lot of basics, your mono red, or at least a red green or red black style. But what it does is against a lot of decks right now, people don't have a lot of basics. Obviously there's the exceptions of like a blue white control, something like that, but for most decks you're going to hit this against an Amalia. This could deal 5 damage and keep them from gaining life. It is a very powerful swing, and I definitely think it'll see good sideboard spots. Don't know if it's going to be a top finisher for a red deck, but it's a very interesting card at the very least. Next up is Storm Chaser's Talent, which honestly, if it just read blue, make a 1/1 Prowess Otter, it's interesting. If the Prowess deck exists, that would be in it. But really what this is it's a blue 1/1 Otter. And then in the mid to late game, when you run out of your spells, or if you get your Treasure Cruise discarded, something like that, you can pay to buy it back. And then in the late game, if you're playing against something like Control or Rakdos or a deck that wants to, 1-for-1 with you, you pay 6 and all of a sudden all of your spells come with an Otter stapled on. So very good card as far as just, a hard to answer permanent that just gives you a good threat. But then in the mid to late game, just tons of value whenever you run out of other things to do, and great against decks that want a 1-for-1 against you. Next up is Scrap Shooter, and this one is to me a very interesting sideboard card for a deck like Mono Green. This deck, it needs cards that fit into certain roles. So having it be a creature instead of a spell that answers an enchantment or artifact is very good because it can be found off Invasion or Oath of Nissa. 4 power, great for your Outcasters and your Kioras. 2 pips, good for your Nykthoses. Reach, great against some of the matchups where people try and fly over you. And again, being a 3-drop, good because it can be found on Storms as well as be cast on turn 2 if you have an Elf. Overall, gifting someone a card to destroy a key artifact or enchantment is worth it. But even in a lot of matchups, just getting to drop a 4/4 on turn 2 is very powerful, and this just adds to the quantity of number that you can do that in this deck. Next up is Mockingbird, which I think is a very interesting card. It's X and blue, and however much you pay total, you can copy a creature with mana X or less. So you're able to more or less take any creature that someone else has and make a copy of it. It can be very powerful at being able to stabilize the board, and if they're paying powerful 2-drops or 3-drops, makes it very cheap because you get to just mirror the cost and then potentially kill their thing, and you have it now. So I think this is a very interesting effect, and it's something where I'm very interested in seeing how it plays out. I think it will definitely be a very solid effect, and in decks where you may want to copy your own lords, things like spirits, very, very nice. So I think it may very well see play in decks like that. Next up, we have Jackdraw Savior, and this one to me screams of decks like spirits. It's a 3-mana 3/1 flyer, so kind of in an odd spot since it's not a spirit, but whenever it or another creature you control with flying dies, you get to return a target creature with lesser mana from your graveyard to the battlefield. So they kill your 3-drop, you get a 2-drop. They kill your 2-drop, you get your 1-drop. So you just get to chain these creatures, and again, this is a lightning rod, so you play this, they kill it, you get to buy back your Supreme Phantom. Since it goes to the battlefield, it's even stronger. They can't just make it go to hand and then deal with it later, and I think this is a card that is going to pretty much make 1-for-1 against a deck like Spirits much, much harder, because as you keep answering the threats, now you have to answer it a second time, a third time, and the chain keeps going. So I think this is a very strong threat at being able to slow down the interaction decks against decks like Spirits. Next up, we have Iridescent Vinelasher, and this is one that I think a lot of people were very excited about when it got spoiled. A 1-mana 1/2, not super exciting, but the Offspring 2, you can pay 3 mana to get 2 of them. One's a 1/1 landfall, deal 1 to target opponent. This goes well with decks that want crime effects, things with spectacle, things that can care if your opponent lost life. There's a lot of lizards in this set. A lot of them look very strong in red-black, and this is probably the best 1-drop you have in that deck. And I think overall, you're able to build a lot of very interesting shells with a creature that just kind of pokes at them early and then has incidental splash damage by just playing your lands. So I think if you're able to play this early or as a 3-drop, it starts to really ramp how much damage you can do directly, and people have to answer your 1-drop as aggressively as they want to answer some of your later threats. I think this is going to open up a lot of decks to have very powerful early games, and then you have cards like Free Strider Lookout that can chain lands, again, once per turn, because otherwise you could more or less chain your entire deck. But in that sense, you'll just keep ramping lands and dealing damage, and all of a sudden you're chipping them down very quickly. Next up, we have Gev Scaled Scorch. This one is one of those lizard cards I was talking about that goes well with the Iridescent Vinelasher. It is a very pushed card as far as the stats go, as a red-black 3/2 with ward, pay 2 life. So again, your 3/2 that immediately costs them life if they want to answer it. Other creatures enter with an additional counter if they've lost life. So again, you pair this with a Vinelasher, you play a land, ping them, now your creatures enter with counters, and whenever you cast a lizard spell, it deals 1. So you can very quickly ramp your creatures into getting counters, gaining bigger and bigger threats, and again, a 3/2 for 2 is very pushed, as we've learned. So if there is going to be a Kindred deck of lizards, this is going to be a big part of it, and if there isn't, I still think it's a very solid card that can still threaten as long as it's just used in an aggressive shell, often probably paired with something like the Vinelasher. Next up, we have Emberheart Challenger, and this is another great aggro card. It goes well slotted in with some of the various Slickshot show-off decks. We've been wanting some more aggro to try and punish some of these more mid-range control decks, and this is a really great example of it. A 2/2 for 2 with Haste Prowess, already great, and the upside is the Valiant. If you're able to trigger it, gets you some extra value, and you already have cards like Ancestral Anger or Monstrous Rage in your deck, but honestly, just another hasty 2/2 Haste Prowess to throw in your aggro decks is a great thing, and really can help push some of these decks with higher card quality to keep trying to punish some of the mid-range slower decks. Next up, we have Dark Star Augur, which goes in those slower, more controlling decks as a 2/3 flying bob, essentially, for 3 mana. It has the same at the beginning of your upkeep, reveal top card, you take damage equal to its mana value and lose that life, but you can offspring it for black, so you get 3 power, 4 toughness, and 2 flyers that have 2 bob triggers every upkeep. So you're playing really cheap cards or a lot of life gain, you're going to churn through your deck, and no one's going to be able to keep up with your card advantage. Having to immediately kill a bob is something that a lot of players have experienced. Now you can get 2 of them that fly and pressure your opponent's life total while refilling your hand. Very strong looking card, and while I think you'll have to be cognizant of how you build your decks with it, it's a very strong card to have access to. Next up is Artist's Talent, and this one to me is very interesting because I think it goes very well with a deck like Boros Pia that allows you to chain your spells, virtually never flooding on lands again, as whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you can discard a card and then draw a card. So your Ren's Resolves are going to chain even harder, even faster. And then once you get to level 2, your your non-creature spells cost 1 less, so you can just chain even harder, giving you essentially a Ruby Medallion in play, and it makes it very easy to be able to just churn all your spells, get to your Showdown of the Skelds, and just take over. Obviously, the final level of being able to do extra damage is great, but honestly, in this deck, I really would just be looking at the base level and maybe level 2 if you want to, but even just being able to churn through and make sure you never flood out is a big part of what makes those decks so threatening when they start going off. Next up, we have probably my favorite card in this set, even if it isn't necessarily the one I expect to do the best, and that's Aggro, Eater of All. This card fascinates me. It has so many ways to go infinite, thanks to Cauldron Familiar, 2 Cauldron Familiars, because they become food. You can sack one to the other and keep chaining them, as well as Camellia, the Seed Miser, allows you to get more 1/1s that you can then sacrifice as additional things. I think there's a green-black food and Citadel deck somewhere in here in the set, thanks to the Mentor as well as this card, and I think it gives you a lot of interesting angles. It may not be able to fight through the power level of right now, but I think as we move forward and other decks may have to fall off or not be as powerful, then it's definitely a card I have my eye on as far as being incredibly powerful, and a card that overall is going to be played somewhere. Next up, I have 3-3 City, and this one honestly is just as simple as it looks. It is a Nykthos for Kindred, and I think that if there is going to be a Kindred deck, something like Elves will already exist, but if something else were to come along, this is going to be a big part of it. Anytime you can cheat on mana and accelerate, it's very strong, especially in something like Pioneer, so don't sleep on this card. Even if it may not be right now, it will be powerful later on. Next up, we have the infamous Cruel Claw, and this card to me reads so well. Even though it doesn't really have a ton of protection, as a 3/3 for 3 menace, you already have a good chance of being able to hit with it as long as it survives. But if it does hit, then you exile from the top and then can cast that card for free by discarding a card. There are ways to build around it that maybe can make it more combo essence or try and like break the fact that you get a free card, but even just hitting them, getting something like a Shieldred or any good value card like a Fable, all of a sudden you are just so far ahead of your opponent and you're able to untap on turn 4, kill their blocker, get in, and you're just off to the races. So I think it's a little fragile, but the upside's worth investigating, and it has a lot of upside. Next up, we have Ral, Crackling Wit, and to me, this card reads like a great sideboard option for decks like Phoenix or like Blue-Red Prowess. The rapid loyalty acceleration can be super powerful, and the draw 3 discard 2 mode is really good if you're able to discard stuff like Phoenix or things with flashback, and the emblem just ends the game. You know, if you get to storm your cantrips, you're going to get way ahead, storm your removal, take out their whole board, or storm a little bit and then play something like a Temporal Trespass and take 3 to 4 turns, and the game just ends on the spot. So I think it's a great pivot, especially because it's that Army in a Can style. Not quite like Saheeli where you get them for free, but even just getting an Otter here or there and then resource dumping into it to get your emblem, very good. If you untap with it in a deck like Phoenix, you should just be able to emblem pretty quickly. So I think this is a great sideboard option and a great powerful card. I don't know if it can stand on its own as like a main deck worthy card, but it's definitely a really powerful sideboard option. Next up, we have Kitsa Otterball Elite, which to me reads like a really push prowess card. A 1/3 Vigilance already is pretty solid. We've seen what Ledger Shredder without Vigilance but with flying can do, and obviously it grows naturally and stays that way. This prowess one will need more spells, but the fact that you can loot after you attack makes it nice to be able to churn through and make sure you can discard your Phoenixes, as well as make sure you never really run out of gas. And then you can copy for 2 mana, target instant sorcery spell you control, and you need to cast 2 spells prior, so its power is 3 or greater. So you cast your first spell, it becomes a 2, you cast your second spell, let the prowess trigger resolve, and then you can copy it. So this will very likely allow you to, get your treasure cruises in multiples, and it begs the question of if you're going to want cards like Galvanic Iteration moving forward, or if this is just a really good threat that you could potentially put in as an addition to Ledger Shredder, or if it just ends up being a Blue-Red Prowess card. But either way, the power level here is worth investigating, and I think it will end up somewhere for sure. Last up, we have Beza the Bounding Spring, which, again, this kind of reads like a Sunset Revelry, but it works for life total, cards in hands, creatures in plays, and lands in play, where if your opponent has more of any of those, you get a bonus effect. The treasure is nice, but again, you're not likely to see it because you're probably playing this on curve. But if you wait till turn 5 to play it in a matchup like that, you can get the treasure just by playing it and then your land. Your cards in hand, again, if you're playing this in like a pivot for a control deck or a sideboard card for them, you're unlikely to get that. unless, you know, you're in something like Phoenix that can really keep their card count up, or in the mirrors. But then with creatures in play and life total, you should almost always be getting this if you're boarding it in. The idea is that in your control decks, you just bring this in as a 4-drop, you interact where you can, and then all of a sudden you slam this, get some extra bodies, gain 4 life, and you have, you know, a ton of bodies in play, a ton of extra life, and it's hard to kill a 4/5, as we've seen with Shieldred. So I think this is a A+ sideboard card for something like blue-white control, and really just an incredibly strong threat at being able to close the game out quickly if people are unsuspecting that you're going to board it in. So I think it'll be a great sideboard option for control, and really a card that will find its place in that home. So there you have it. Those are 25 cards that I'm very excited about for Pioneer. I had to trim this list down from 30, 35 because I think this set has a ton of interesting cards that either can help existing archetypes or it could make their own depending on the power level. It feels like a set that's going to change some things in Pioneer. Obviously, we've had a lot of stagnation in Pioneer and a lot of the decks are very similar, and a lot of these cards may only boost up those decks, but I think we are going to see a lot more things like Prowess. We'll see some Kindred decks, and a lot of these decks will look different than we've seen before and maybe bolster some of the decks that have been in the D, C, or B tier. I don't think a lot of the top tier decks got a ton outside of like 1 or 2 cards here or there, but I think it should create enough more help for the lower tier deck to try and fight those top tier decks, barring the exceptions of things like Dewdrop Cure for Amalia that does have me worried. But with a ban coming up in August, we'll obviously see how the format shakes out. But going into the first weeks of Bloomburrow Pioneer, I'm super excited and there's a ton to mess with. Appreciate everybody watching. Let me know in the comments down below what cards you're excited for, what you think decks will look like moving to the new set, how you feel about the new set. I'm super excited. I wasn't thinking I was going to be, but then the cards came out and it looked incredible to me. So thanks everybody. Until next time.